If I'd known owning a lake meant declaring war on a woman with a clipboard and a god complex, I would have bought a desert instead. She came charging across my property like she was auditioning for Real Housewives of the HOA apocalypse. Red blazer with a homemade HOA logo ironed on, and the kind of self-importance that only comes from leading a PDA coup that made headlines. But wait, why was she yelling at me on my own land? "You're violating community fishing codes," she screamed, right in front of my confused fish. That's how I met Shelley Voss, part-time wellness guru, full-time pawn tyrant. What followed involved fake fines, pool test strips, local news drama, and an ending so satisfying it should be illegal. Ever had an HOA try to colonize your backyard? Share your horror stories below. I'll bring the popcorn if you bring the drama. Picture this: a perfect Texas Hill Country morning. I'd been living on my 50-acre ranch for 2 years after quitting the corporate grind and launching my nature podcast. The sun was just peeking over the horizon, painting my private lake in gold and amber. I had my favorite coffee mug in one hand, my lucky fishing rod in the other, and absolutely zero problems in the world. Life was exactly what I dreamed it would be. Then Hurricane Shelley hit. I heard her before I saw her, a shrill voice cutting through the morning calm like a buzzsaw through silk. "Excuse me. Excuse me, sir." I turned to see a woman marching across my land like she owned the place. She had the classic Karen haircut, that choppy blonde bob screaming, "I need to speak to your manager." She was decked out in a blazing red blazer with a clearly homemade HOA logo, something she wore with delusional pride. Her fake nails were so long and red, I wondered how she managed to write anything without stabbing the paper. "You need to stop fishing immediately," she snapped, pointing one of those talons at me. "You don't have a permit for this waterway." At first, I laughed. Who shows up at someone's private property at 6 a.m. demanding fishing permits? But her face told me she was dead serious. She truly believed she had the authority to tell me what I could and couldn't do on my own land. I calmly tried to explain I owned the lake, all the paperwork to prove it. But Shelley wasn't interested in logic. She whipped out a laminated badge that looked like a kid's craft project. "I'm the lake safety officer for this community," she declared, flashing the fake badge like she was some kind of federal agent. "And you are in violation of multiple environmental regulations." You won't believe what happened next. She started snapping photos of me holding my fishing rod like I was some kind of criminal. Even took shots of my coffee mug as evidence. Then she handed me a handwritten citation, looking like a grocery list, demanding $500 for illegal fishing in protected waters. I stared at this ridiculous piece of paper, her chicken scratch handwriting, and realized I was dealing with someone who'd completely lost touch with reality. But instead of getting angry, I felt this weird calm. Maybe it was the peaceful morning, or maybe the absurdity of it all. I just smiled and said, "I'll look into this." The smug satisfaction on her face told me she thought she'd won. Little did she know, I was just getting started. Within an hour, I had a brand new sign posted at my property's edge. "Karen's not welcome." If Shelley wanted to play games, I could play too. But this was only the opening move in what would become the most ridiculous property dispute in Texas history. The very next morning, my phone rang. It was Roy Garrison, the HOA secretary, sounding like someone had a gun to his head. "Mr. Morgan," he said shakily, "Shelley has scheduled an environmental investigation of your property for this afternoon. I just wanted to give you a heads up because, well, I think this is getting out of hand." When the investigation arrived, you won't believe the show that unfolded. Shelley pulled up in her beat-up Honda Civic, dressed like she was heading into Chernobyl, bright yellow rain boots, rubber gloves to her elbows, and a plastic shower curtain fashioned into a hazmat suit. She even brought a toolbox filled with pool cleaning supplies. Roy followed behind, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Shelley waved test strips around, dipping them in my lake like she was conducting groundbreaking research, holding each strip up to the light with NASA engineer intensity. Halfway through, she even started recording herself on her phone, narrating like a professional environmental scientist, though the only thing she sold was online confidence courses. One neighbor walked by and asked, "Ma'am, why are you testing that water like it's a urine sample?" Shelley's face when she was called out? priceless. As the neighbors gathered, Shelley launched into a dramatic speech about how my fishing threatened the entire community's watershed. Most looked confused, the appropriate reaction to that level of crazy. After an hour of her performance, Shelley marched to my door, practically vibrating with excitement. "Preliminary results are worse than I feared," she announced, waving pool test strips and handing me a $750 citation for continued environmental violations. Later that evening, my wise neighbor Nora Whitman stopped by with homemade cookies and a knowing smile. She told me everything: how Shelley's online confidence coaching business had collapsed, how she'd bullied other families into paying fake fines, and how she'd wormed her way into HOA presidency with empty promises. Nora winked and said, "You're not the type to roll over. This is going to get interesting." That night, Nora told me something that changed everything. "We used to have a community pond here 20 years ago." Those words kept spinning in my head as I tried to sleep. If that pond really existed, where was it now? And why was Shelley claiming authority over my private lake instead of the community water? The next day, Nora and I became detectives, digging through dusty old records and photo albums in the community center, evidence of the pond's glorious past and the heart of our community. What we uncovered would blow this whole case wide open right in the heart of what was now the newer section of our neighborhood. Kids used to fish in a beautiful community pond. Families had picnics there, and it was clearly the centerpiece of community life. But when the housing market boomed in the early 2000s, developers filled it in to build 6 more houses. Here's the kicker: the pond that Shelley kept claiming jurisdiction over didn't exist anymore. It had been buried under concrete and suburban lawns 15 years before she even moved here. Nora had more stories beyond the official records. "I remember the day they brought in the dump trucks," she said, shaking her head sadly. "Half the community was in tears, but the other half was excited about rising property values. Back then, the HOA was run by developers who promised the new houses would enhance the community character. What a load of garbage that turned out to be." She showed me photos of the filling process, massive trucks dumping dirt and gravel into what had once been crystal clear water. Mrs. Martha Henderson cried for a week when they killed the old oak trees surrounding the pond. But here's where it gets interesting. The Henderson family, an elderly couple living on the edge of our community, owned a gorgeous 3-acre plot with a natural pond still intact. Frank and Martha Henderson were both in their late 70s and had been talking about moving to Florida to be closer to their grandkids. According to Nora, they'd been increasingly frustrated with the HOA's petty rules. Just last month, Shelley had cited them for excessive noise because their dog barked when people walked by their fence. The more I learned about the Hendersons, the more an absolutely diabolical plan started forming in my mind. That evening, I paid them a visit. Frank answered the door, a tall, weathered man with kind eyes and hands telling a story of a lifetime of honest work. When I introduced myself as the guy fighting the crazy HOA lady, his face lit up like Christmas morning. "You're the fishing fellow," he exclaimed, calling Martha over. "Come meet the man who put up that sign about Karens." They invited me in for coffee. It was clear they were good people, pushed around one too many times by petty bureaucrats and power-hungry neighbors. Sitting in their kitchen overlooking their pond, Frank told me about months of harassment, everything from mailbox height to garden hose color. "That woman has made our lives miserable," Martha said, shaking her head. "We've lived here peacefully for 25 years. Now we can't even enjoy our own backyard without worrying about breaking some ridiculous rule." When I asked about their plans to move, Frank's eyes grew wistful. "We want peace in our golden years," he said, "especially after dealing with that Voss woman." That's when I made them an offer they couldn't refuse. I explained my situation with Shelley, her fake claims about the community pond, and my suspicion she had no clue where the real pond had been. Then I asked if they'd be interested in selling their property to someone who would really appreciate it and use it to teach one HOA president a lesson she'd never forget. The look between Frank and Martha was pure mischief. "Son," Frank said with a grin, "if buying our place helps you stick it to that witch, we'll give you the best deal you've ever seen." As I drove home that night, I couldn't stop smiling. Shelley had called an emergency community meeting for tomorrow night, planning to present her evidence against me. Little did she know, I just bought the perfect weapon for that meeting. The Henderson sale was rushed through. Shelley's meeting was looming, and I wanted the deed in my hand before she started her presentation. Frank and Martha were thrilled to move to Florida and stick it to Shelley, agreeing to close by 5 p.m. the day of the meeting. By that evening, I was officially the owner of the most beautiful 3-acre pond in the county, and Shelley still had no idea what was coming. The community center was packed that night. Word had spread about the environmental crisis at my property, and neighbors were curious. Shelley came prepared, laptop, projector, and a full multimedia presentation. She wore her most official-looking navy blazer, clipboard thick with papers. Roy sat in the front row, looking like he might throw up. I walked in 5 minutes late, taking a seat at the back. Shell's eyes locked onto me immediately, that triumphant smile spreading across her face. She thought this was her moment of victory, her chance to publicly humiliate me and cement herself as the community's environmental protector. What she didn't know was that I had the Henderson property deed in my jacket pocket, and a plan that would turn her triumph into a disaster. Shelley's presentation was a masterpiece of fake science and manufactured outrage. Dramatic photos of me fishing, red arrows pointing to violations, scary captions about environmental terrorism, charts with fake water quality data, supposedly proving my fishing contaminated the watershed. It was so over the top I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing. She stood at the front like a prosecutor, delivering a closing argument. "This man," she said, pointing at me, "has shown complete disregard for our community's environmental safety. His reckless fishing has created contamination levels threatening every family here. The water samples prove dangerous chemical imbalances affecting property values, children's health, and our very way of life." The room grew uncomfortable. Some nodded along, but others looked skeptical. Nora, bless her heart, asked innocent questions like, "What exactly makes fishing dangerous? Have these chemicals been tested by a real lab?" Roy's part was painful to watch. Shelley clearly coached him, but his heart wasn't in it. He stumbled through his lines like a kid who forgot his words, barely making eye contact. Then came Shell's big finish, recommending a $2,500 fine, a public apology, and a permanent fishing ban on all community waterways. $2.5 grand was serious money. Even those buying her story looked surprised. That's when I stood up and asked a question that changed everything. "Shelley, I think we should all see this community pond you keep talking about. Why don't we meet there tomorrow afternoon so everyone can see what we're really dealing with?" The confidence on Shell's face was priceless. She thought I was walking into a trap, agreeing to a public humiliation at the scene of my supposed crimes. "Absolutely," she said, practically bouncing with excitement. "Everyone should see exactly what this man has done to our precious community waterway." As the meeting broke up, I shook her hand and told her I looked forward to our pond visit. She had no idea she'd just agreed to her own public execution. That night, I barely slept, not nervous, but excited. After 15 years in the corporate world, building and selling my tech startup, I'd bought this ranch for peace. Deep, soul-restoring quiet, surrounded by nature. Ironically, my search for tranquility had led me into the biggest battle of my adult life. I got to the Henderson place early to prepare for our gathering. Frank and Martha had moved most belongings to Florida, but left a folding table and chairs just for this occasion. "We wouldn't miss this for the world," Martha told me over the phone. "We're driving back from Florida just to watch that horrible woman get what's coming to her." The pond looked absolutely stunning in the afternoon light. Crystal clear water reflecting towering oak trees, a small dock perfect for fishing, and not a single sign of the environmental contamination Shelley had claimed was poisoning our community's waterways. People started arriving around 3 p.m. I'd invited the whole neighborhood to what I was calling the pond inspection, and the turnout was better than I'd hoped. Nora came with her camera, curious neighbors brought their kids, and even folks from outside our immediate area had heard about the drama and wanted to see how it played out. Everyone was looking around, clearly wondering what this had to do with the environmental crisis Shelley had been preaching about. The confusion on their faces said it all. This didn't look anything like the disaster Shell had described. Bob Williams, the neighbor who'd questioned Shelley's testing methods, showed up with his whole family. I had to see this for myself, he said. After watching that woman test your lake water like it was a urine sample, I figured whatever happens today would be worth witnessing. His wife Sarah was ready for a long show, carrying a lawn chair and cooler, clearly settled. And for the entertainment, even old Mr. Peterson from down the street hobbled over with his walker, muttering something about finally getting some excitement around here. Shelley arrived fashionably late, clearly expecting to make a grand entrance. She brought Roy along, clipboard in hand, camera ready to document my public humiliation for posterity. But as soon as she stepped out of her car, I saw confusion wash over her face. This wasn't my property. This wasn't the lake where she'd cited me for illegal fishing. This was somewhere completely different. "What is this place?" she asked nervously. "This isn't where we were supposed to meet." That's when I dropped the first bomb. "Actually, Shell, this is where we were supposed to meet. This is the real community pond." I pulled out the Henderson property deed dated just 2 days earlier and held it up for everyone to see. "You see, I did some research after your presentation last night. Turns out, our community did have a pond once upon a time. This pond, the original community pond that was filled in back in 2003 to make room for more houses." The crowd started to murmur, pulling out phones to record what was clearly going to be a very memorable afternoon. Sarah Williams gasped audibly, "Wait, you bought the Henderson place. But what about Frank and Martha?" I smiled and gestured toward the elderly couple emerging from their car with matching grins. "They're moving to Florida to be closer to their grandchildren," I said, "and they were more than happy to sell to someone who appreciates what this property represents." Frank waved at the crowd like he was accepting an Oscar, clearly delighted to be part of the show about to unfold. Shelley's face went through 6 emotions in 10 seconds: confusion, disbelief, anger, panic, and finally, desperate defiance. She was going to double down on her lies rather than admit she'd been wrong. "That's impossible," she sputtered. "This is fraud. You can't just buy community property and claim it's yours." But Nora was ready. She pulled out historical evidence, copies of old meeting minutes, photos from the archives, and testimonials from longtime residents who remembered fishing in this exact pond as kids. Meanwhile, Roy was having what could only be described as a complete moral breakdown. Watching Shelley frantically try to explain away the truth seemed to break something inside him. "I can't do this anymore," he said, his voice echoing through the crowd. "Shell, you made me fake those documents. You made me lie about the water testing. None of this was real." The crowd went dead silent. This wasn't just about property disputes or HOA overreach. This was about systematic fraud and deliberate deception. But I wasn't done yet. I pulled out a sign I had made that morning, a beautiful wooden placard reading, "Community Property, Property Officers Banned." "You see, Shell," I said, gesturing toward the pond. "You kept talking about community waterways and environmental protection. Well, now you have one. This is officially community water again." I paused for dramatic effect, savoring the growing horror on Shell's face. "Well, it would be, except for one small problem. I own it now, and as the legal owner of this property, I'm officially banning you from ever setting foot here again." The crowd's reaction was everything I'd hoped for and more. Some laughed, others applauded, and a few stood frozen, mouths hanging open, trying to process what they'd just witnessed. Shelley sputtered desperately, trying to salvage what little authority she had left. But it was too late. The truth was out. The lies had been exposed. Everyone could see exactly what kind of person she really was. As I hammered the sign into the ground next to the pond, I looked back at Shell and smiled. "You wanted community oversight of water resources? Congratulations, you got it." Shelley screamed about going to the media. Perfect. I was hoping she'd say that. As the crowd began to disperse, Shelley was practically hyperventilating with rage, shouting about lawsuits and fraud, swearing she would expose this scam to everyone. Most people just shook their heads and walked away, but I could tell she was serious about escalating things. What she didn't realize was that I'd been hoping she'd take this public. Nothing destroys a bully like having their behavior broadcast far and wide. Sure enough, the next morning I got a call from Jessica Martinez, a reporter from our local TV station. "Mr. Morgan," she said, I've been contacted by Shelley Voss. She claims you've stolen community property and are running some kind of real estate scam. She provided what she says is evidence of environmental crimes and fraud. Would you like to comment?" I could barely contain my excitement. I told Jessica I'd be happy to provide my side, along with documentation she might find interesting. We arranged to meet at the pond that afternoon for what I called a press conference to clear up all confusion. I spent the morning preparing evidence boards telling the whole story, timelines, photos of the original pond and its filling, copies of Shelley's ridiculous citations, screenshots of Roy's confession, and most importantly, the deed proving my legitimate purchase of the Henderson land. I even printed some of Shelley's old failed life coaching ads just to give context about who we were dealing with. Jessica arrived with a cameraman around 2 p.m. I could tell she smelled a good story. Local news loves bureaucratic overreach and community drama, especially when there's a clear villain and a satisfying resolution. As Jessica reviewed the evidence boards, her eyebrows rose higher with each revelation. "This is incredible," she said, holding one of Shelley's handwritten citations. "She actually tried to fine you for fishing on your own property." When I showed her photos of Shelley's fake hazmat suit investigation, Jessica actually laughed out loud. I walked her through the timeline, the evidence, and explained how Shelley had been harassing families with fake rules and fraudulent claims. "The really sad part," I told Jessica, "is she convinced people she was protecting the environment when she was actually bullying her neighbors for her own ego." Jessica took furious notes, already crafting the story in her head. The cameraman got perfect shots of the pristine pond, the HOA official ban sign, and the historical photos Nora brought. Roy showed up uninvited, exactly what I hoped. His on-camera confession was even more damning than before. "She threatened my job if I didn't go along," he told Jessica. "Made me sign fake documents, lie to the community, pretend those tests were real science. I knew it was wrong, but I was scared. I needed the income." Watching Roy finally tell the truth was like watching someone shed a 100-pound weight off their shoulders. Nora arrived with several longtime residents, ready to share their own stories of Shelley's harassment. Mrs. Patterson talked about being fined for having the wrong color garden hose. Mr. Johnson described getting fined for parking his truck in his own driveway because it violated aesthetic standards. Bob Williams recounted the absurd scene of Shelley testing lake water with pool chemicals. The picture that emerged was clear: a woman systematically terrorizing an entire community with fake authority and manufactured violations. Jessica took furious notes, realizing this was a much bigger story than she'd thought. The cameraman captured everything: the beautiful pond Shelley claimed didn't exist, the historical photos proving the real community pond's location, and most importantly, the genuine anger and relief in people's voices as they told their stories. Bob Williams summed it up best to the camera: "It's like she was running some kind of protection racket. Pay up or get harassed until you move away." Even Frank and Martha Henderson made an appearance via video call from Florida, explaining how Shelley's relentless harassment had pushed them to leave their home of 25 years. That evening, the story aired on the 6 o'clock news with the headline, "HOA President's Fishing Fraud Exposed." The coverage showed footage of the beautiful pond, interviewed community members about Shelley's harassment campaigns, and featured Roy's damning confession about falsifying documents. The piece ended with me standing next to my HOA official's ban sign, explaining that sometimes you have to fight back against bullies using their own tactics. Within hours, the story was picked up by other local stations and spread across social media like wildfire. But the best part was watching Shelley's reaction. According to Nora, who lived across the street from her, Shelley spent the evening frantically calling the TV station, demanding retractions and threatening lawsuits. She even posted a long, rambling response on social media, claiming the story was a hit job by wealthy outsiders trying to destroy community values. The more she tried to defend herself, the more unhinged she sounded. Neighbors reported seeing her pacing her house at all hours, talking loudly on the phone and gesturing wildly at anyone who walked by. The community's response was swift and decisive. By the next morning, I had dozens of messages from neighbors apologizing for doubting me and thanking me for standing up to Shelley. More importantly, talk was already underway about an emergency HOA meeting to remove Shelley from her position and investigate her other alleged violations. The woman who terrorized people with fake authority was about to learn what real accountability looked like. And best of all, it was all happening exactly how she'd wanted, with the whole community watching. The emergency meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. at the community center, the final showdown. The word spread fast. People who hadn't been involved in HOA politics for years planned to attend. Even folks from neighboring communities heard about Pond Gate and wanted to witness the conclusion of this drama. The meeting was standing room only. The community center buzzed with energy and anticipation, conversations swirling about Shelley's fraudulent citations, Roy's confession, and the news coverage that had made our neighborhood famous across the county. Shelley walked in about 10 minutes late, clearly aiming for a dramatic entrance. But the room went dead, silent the moment she appeared. Instead of greetings, an uncomfortable hush filled the air. A clear sign she knew her standing had crumbled. Roy, reinstated as secretary under emergency provisions, relished his role in Shelley's downfall. In a clear, steady voice very different from his nervous stammer before, he read the charges against her. Falsification of official documents, harassment of community members, abuse of authority, and misrepresentation of HOA powers. He announced the board recommended immediate removal from office and a full investigation into other possible violations during her tenure. Shelley tried to interrupt several times, but the hostility in the room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. When she finally spoke in her defense, it was exactly what you'd expect from someone completely detached from reality. She claimed I orchestrated an elaborate conspiracy against her, said Roy was lying about falsifying documents, and insisted the community was making a huge mistake, falling for the tricks of a wealthy outsider. She even suggested my property purchase was illegal and that the real community pond was still my private lake. It was painful to watch, like seeing someone dig their own grave while insisting they were building a swimming pool. The vote wasn't even close. 37 votes to remove Shelley from office, 2 abstentions, and 0 in her favor. When Roy announced the results, the room erupted in applause that lasted nearly a full minute. Shelley sat stunned for a few seconds before gathering her things and walking out without a word. Through the community center windows, we could see her sitting in her car in the parking lot for nearly 20 minutes, probably processing what had just happened to her carefully constructed kingdom of fake authority. But the best was yet to come. As the meeting wrapped up, I stood and made an announcement I'd been planning for days. I'd like to invite everyone in this community to a celebration at my pond this Saturday, I said. We're going to have a barbecue, some fishing, and a proper celebration of what happens when a community stands up to bullies together. Everyone is welcome. I paused for dramatic effect and added with a smile, well, everyone except former HOA presidents who've been banned from the property. The laughter that followed was worth every penny I'd spent on the Henderson place. Saturday's pond party was absolutely perfect. The smell of barbecue smoke drifted across the water while kids splashed in the shallows and adults cast lines from the dock. Frank and Martha Henderson drove up from Florida to join the celebration, sharing stories about their new retirement community and their gratitude for selling their property to someone who truly appreciated it. You know, Martha said, watching children play in the same water where she'd learned to fish 60 years ago. This pond is finally being loved the way it was meant to be. Roy brought his kids, who were thrilled to fish in a pond where they didn't have to worry about citations. Nora set up a photo display showcasing the history of community ponds, turning the event into an impromptu lesson on local environmental heritage. This is what we lost when they filled in the first pond, she told a group of fascinated children. But now we have it back, thanks to someone who understood what it really meant. The kids especially loved learning that their grandparents might have fished in the original pond, a beautiful connection across generations. Throughout the afternoon, cars kept driving slowly past the pond. I counted at least 6 drive-bys from a familiar Honda Civic. Each time Shelley's car appeared, party guests waved enthusiastically and pointed toward the HOA official's band sign, which had become a local landmark. Bob Williams brought a cooler full of beer and held court near the barbecue grill, retelling Shelley's fake investigation stories with dramatic flair. She was out there testing that water like she was diagnosing a kidney infection, he declared, prompting another round of laughter. The final chapter of Shelley's saga played out over the following weeks. Faced with potential legal action for document fraud and harassment, she quietly put her house on the market and moved away. The for sale sign in her yard became a neighborhood fixture, especially after someone anonymously added a small placard underneath that read former HOA. Her house sat on the market for months, eventually selling well below asking price to a young family who had no idea about its infamous history. As for me, I returned to my peaceful morning fishing routine, now with a better understanding of how quickly tranquility can be shattered by those who mistake authority for wisdom. My pond has become an unofficial community gathering spot where neighbors drop by to fish, chat, and share stories about the time we all learned that sometimes the best way to deal with a bully is to let them defeat themselves. Every morning, when I cast my line into the calm water, I remember that some battles are worth fighting, especially when justice tastes as sweet as victory, served with a side of property ownership. Nora often stops by in the evenings, sharing stories about the old days when the original community pond was the heart of neighborhood life. You know, she told me just last week, while watching the sunset reflect off the water, this pond was always meant to bring people together. It just took the right person to make that happen again. As kids from the neighborhood splash in the shallows where Martha Henderson learned to fish 70 years ago, I realized that sometimes the best revenge isn't just getting even. It's restoring something beautiful that was lost. If you enjoyed watching a Karen get exactly what she deserved, make sure to hit that like button and tell me in the comments about the most ridiculous HOA story you've ever heard. At HOA Journal, we don't just tell stories, we let the chaos speak for itself.